On a quiet Sunday morning in the small American town of Millfield, the golden light of dawn spilled gently over the modest white church that had stood at the center of the community for nearly a century, its steeple rising into the sky like a promise of peace and faith. And in the parking lot, where gravel crunched beneath the tires of arriving families, and the sound of hymns spilled faintly from open doors, there sat a dog, a large German shepherd of about 8 years old, his thick coat of sable and tan fur, slightly grizzled around the muzzle with age, his amber eyes sharp and watchful, yet softened by an unmistakable air of loyalty. And though many who came to the church that morning recognized him as Max, the beloved companion once belonging to Sergeant Daniel Whitaker, a young soldier who had grown up in this very town, gone off to war, and tragically never returned, the sight of the animal lying resolute by the edge of the parking lot stirred whispers and uneasy glances, for Max refused to move no matter who passed, his great body pressed firmly against a small, weathered box adorned with a tarnished metal inside, the bronze star that had been awarded to Daniel posthumously, a decoration that symbolized both courage and the immense cost of sacrifice. And it was this silent vigil of the dog that became the beginning of a story which none in Millfield would ever forget. Families filed into the church in their Sunday best, men in pressed shirts and clean-shaven faces, women in floral dresses with their hair neatly pinned, children tugging at their mothers' hands as they gazed curiously at the stubborn German shepherd who neither barked nor growled, only fixed his vigilant stare on anyone who dared come close to the metal. And among them was Pastor James Holloway, a tall man in his late 50s, with a kind but weathered face, silver streaks running through his neatly trimmed beard, his eyes carrying the quiet wisdom of a man who had spent decades consoling the grieving and guiding the hopeful. When he approached Max with a soft voice and an outstretched hand, the dog merely flicked his ears back, gave a low rumble of warning from deep in his chest, and pressed his body even tighter against the metal case, as if declaring in no uncertain terms that this sacred relic would not be touched. Pastor James straightened slowly, sighing, for he knew this animal well, having seen him accompany Daniel on many walks through town before deployment, and he whispered to the gathering parishioners that perhaps it was best to let the dog be, that something holy was at work here, and so they filed inside, leaving the shepherd to his watch. Among the congregation that day was Evelyn Whitaker, Daniel's mother, a woman in her early 60s with a frame once strong from years of working double shifts at the local diner, but now bent slightly with grief, her pale skin lined from sleepless nights, her once dark hair turned mostly silver, though she wore it neatly, pulled into a bun, and though she dressed simply in a faded blue dress, her presence commanded quiet respect. For everyone knew her story, and when she stepped from her car and saw Max curled around the medal her son had earned with his life, her lips trembled, her hands clutched the handle of her worn purse, and her eyes filled with tears because she had not seen the dog in months, not since he had wandered off after Daniel's funeral, disappearing as though the weight of loss had driven him into the wilderness. And yet here he was again, returned to the very heart of the town, as though carrying a message she could not yet decipher. She approached slowly, her sensible shoes crunching the gravel, and whispered the dog's name, Max, her voice breaking with emotion. But though the shepherd's ears flicked and his tail thumped once against the ground in recognition, he did not abandon his post, and Evelyn, understanding somehow that this was more than a simple reunion, sank onto the church steps, with tears streaking her cheeks as she whispered prayers that maybe her boy's spirit had guided the animal here. Soon more townsfolk gathered. Clara Jensen, the young schoolteacher with her tall frame, auburn curls, and lively green eyes who always wore cheerful dresses even in times of sorrow, murmured to the children to stay back. Sheriff Thomas Keene, a broad-shouldered man in his 40s with a neatly shaved face, sun-creased skin from years of patrolling dusty county roads, and a stern demeanor tempered by an innate sense of fairness, stood with arms crossed, trying to decide if the dog was a public nuisance or something more profound. And even Harold Briggs, the gruff mechanic with oil-stained hands and a permanent scowl etched into his square jaw, paused to wipe his brow with a rag and mutter that maybe the animal knew something. None of them did. As the service began inside, the dog remained still outside, the sunlight glinting off the metal within its box, and whispers swelled that perhaps Max was guarding not only a piece of metal, but the very spirit of Daniel Whitaker himself, who had fallen overseas while shielding his unit from an ambush. His heroism recounted in solemn letters, read at his funeral, letters that spoke of bravery, yet could never fill the gaping hole left in his mother's heart, nor the empty pew in the church where he once sat with Max at his feet. When the congregation emerged an hour later, they found Max unchanged, his great body unyielding, though his eyes glistened with something that seemed more than animal instinct, and Evelyn, her heart aching, sat beside him and stroked his fur, whispering that perhaps God had sent him back as a guardian. And though the townsfolk could not explain it, they felt in that moment a stirring of reverence, as though the parking lot itself had become hallowed ground. Rumors spread quickly in the days that followed. Some said the dog had been seen at the cemetery at night, lying beside Daniel's grave. Others swore they heard faint whimpers as though he were conversing with his lost master. And children passing the church on their way to school often paused to offer bits of food, which the shepherd accepted politely, but always returned to his post beside the metal, never straying far, as if bound by invisible chains of loyalty. News traveled to neighboring towns, and soon strangers began arriving, just to glimpse the phenomenon of a dog guarding a fallen soldier's honor. Reporters with cameras tried to capture the image, but were often humbled into silence by the sheer solemnity of the scene, and veterans who had worn uniforms themselves came to salute both the metal and the animal who protected it, tears sliding down hardened faces as they whispered that no human guard could stand more faithfully. Through it all, Evelyn visited daily, sitting beside Max, sometimes speaking to him as though he were the last living connection to her boy, sometimes simply resting her hand on his thick fur and letting the silence speak louder than words. And though her grief remained, there was a strange comfort in knowing that Daniel's spirit seemed not entirely gone, so long as this loyal creature kept his vigil. And so the first chapter of this extraordinary tale was written, not with ink upon paper, but with the steady thump of a dog's heart and the shimmer of a metal reflecting sunlight, and everyone who passed through that small church parking lot knew they were witnessing the unfolding of something sacred, something that transcended the ordinary boundaries between man and beast, life and death, grief and hope. And though none could say what would come next, all understood instinctively that Max's refusal to move was not mere stubbornness, but a testament to a bond unbroken even by the grave. By Monday afternoon, the small tranquility of Millfield had begun to tilt on its axis, for news travels with a different gravity when it circles around grief, loyalty, and a gleam of bronze. And though the church steps had always been a place for casseroles and gentle gossip, they now became a stage where strangers' questions pressed against the town's need for reverence, which is why Sheriff Thomas Keene returned in his tan uniform with the sun-flattened brim of his hat low over his blue eyes, his clean-shaven jaw set in the patient firmness of a man who understood that crowds can behave like rivers when they find a narrow bend. He had built a life out of steady decisions, out of recognizing that the angry men he hauled from bar fights were sometimes the very boys he had taught to fish years ago, And the event that had shaped him most was a winter night, 15 years back, when his kid brother, wild on a snowmobile, had crashed into a fence and Thomas had been first on scene, the one who turned off the engine and held the frantic hand until the shouting and sirens became only the quiet hiss of falling snow. Since then, his code had been simple. Protect what is fragile with whatever strength you have. So now, with Max lying like a carved guardian beside the weathered metal box, Thomas set sawhorses to keep the curious from crowding, posted a deputy at the lot's entrance, and told Pastor James that the dog could stay where he was, until they figured out exactly why he'd returned and where in God's name that metal had come from. The question hung in the air, like the dust that rose when cars pulled in. How had Max gotten the metal? And why had he planted himself in front of the church, as if he'd been given orders by a voice none of the rest of them could hear? Evelyn Whitaker, her back straightened by purpose, if not by time, smoothed the skirt of her blue dress and sat near the dog with the protectiveness of a mother hen, her hands never far from Max's collar, as if she were the one guarding him now. And when people asked, she told them the story of the night Daniel had received the Bronze Star posthumously, how the ceremony felt like a split in the world where pride poured down one side and sorrow down the other, and how Max had paced afterward, whining at the shadow box as if it contained a pulse, though she admitted that after the funeral, the dog simply vanished, and the box along with him, and she had not seen either again until yesterday morning, when she turned into the lot and found him here, like an old lighthouse, returned to the cliff it once called home. Into this mixture of wonder and questions stepped a young woman with a camera bag and a notebook clutched tight against her slim coat, her figure long-limbed and determined, height about 5'9", with an athletic grace that came from long city walks and yoga at dawn, copper-brown hair cut in a sharp bob that framed an olive-toned face where clear hazel eyes scanned a scene, not for spectacle, but for truth. Her name was Maya Delgado, 27, a reporter for the regional paper out of Riverbend, still early in her career, but already known to chase long shots with the relentlessness of someone whose father had once been lost to a story nobody bothered to tell right. She wore dark jeans, ankle boots, and a charcoal blazer layered over a white blouse, and as she approached Pastor James, she introduced herself with a firm, respectful voice, careful to say that she wasn't there to sensationalize the dog, only to understand what it meant to the town, and her questions came gently. When did Max arrive? Who owns the metal? Who has the right to move it? Who decides what sacred means in a parking lot with oil stains and chalked hopscotch squares? As she watched, Max lifted his head, ears pricking, and studied her without aggression, which is how animals sometimes look at people who carry old sadness. They see the outline of a wound and choose not to prod it. A different kind of attention arrived behind her, in the shape of a man whose polished shoes didn't belong on gravel, and whose smooth, clean-shaven face was topped by hair so carefully parted it looked drawn with a ruler. This was Richard Rick Dalton, late 30s, medium height, but eager posture, tailored gray suit sharp enough to slice the morning, a local real estate developer who had made his money-flipping old farmhouses, and lately had joined the church trustees with the enthusiasm of an entrepreneur who calls himself a servant of the community when he sees an advantage in being near the microphone. He praised Max loudly for the cameras, clapping his hands, and then turned with a practiced smile to say that for liability reasons, the dog should be moved out of the lot and the metal secured inside a locked display case. Don't worry. He had a glass case in storage from a commemorative ribbon cutting. The timing was perfect, the optics excellent, and he made the mistake of stepping a little too close to the box, at which Max growled a low thunder that rumbled through the soles of every foot in the lot, and Rick's polished shoes found reverse. The sound pulled a tall, gangly teenager from the edges of the crowd, 16-year-old Liam Carter, a boy who tended to appear where decisions needed a conscience, all elbows and earnestness. His narrow face freckled, brown hair perpetually flopping into eyes the color of wet soil after rain. He wore a gray hoodie under a thrift store blazer because he had sprinted from algebra, and he skidded to a stop beside Sheriff Keene with breathless urgency to say he thought he knew where the box had been before it arrived here. Liam volunteered with the church maintenance crew, sweeping leaves from the back steps, and 2 nights earlier, Saturday near dusk, he'd heard what sounded like a cry or a moan behind the old tool shed that backed onto the alley behind Mrs. Hargrove's bakery. When he'd looked, he'd seen a shadow vanish and the shed door left slightly ajar. Afraid, he'd shut it and gone home, ashamed now that he hadn't checked inside. And on Sunday morning, early, he'd come to set up chairs, but found Max instead, panting hard and wet around the muzzle, as if he'd carried something heavy, lying down, with the box clutched between his front legs, like a wounded thing. That was enough for Sheriff Keene, who nodded to Deputy Carla Ruiz, a compact woman in her mid-30s with deft hands and a runner's stride, skin the warm brown of her Mexican-American heritage, hair braided tight against her scalp, eyes quick as flint, and voice light with humor unless duty required steel. And the two of them headed around the side of the church with Liam and Maya and Evelyn following at a respectful distance. The tool shed smelled faintly of oil and cedar, sunlight knifing through the slats to make columns of floating dust, and Carla crouched to examine the scuffed dirt by the door, while Thomas lifted the latch. Inside, they found a coil of orange extension cord, a half-empty box of nails, a rake with a missing tooth, and on the floor, near a crushed coffee cup, a spray of glass splinters like an exploded star. Maya's reporter brain captured the scene in layers while Liam whispered that he'd never noticed broken glass before, and Carla pinched a fragment in the tip of a pen and tilted it toward the light. Thick, curved, clear, the kind you'd expect from a shadow box frame. On a shelf, a folded church bulletin with a damp ring of coffee across the date. Friday. There were faint drag marks across the dusty floor toward the door, and in the dirt outside, paw prints, deep and determined, toe pads splayed wide the way a dog spread, under load. Back in the lot, Pastor James listened as Thomas briefed him quietly. Maybe someone had stashed the metal here. Maybe they'd planned to steal it from the family. Maybe Max had intercepted the act and dragged the box out before they could return, which would explain the wet muzzle and the dog's refusal to leave. The idea that Daniel's metal had been in danger tightened Evelyn's mouth into a line thin enough to cut paper, and for the first time she stood between Dalton and the box, without realizing it, not with hostility, but with a mother's reflex to make herself a wall. As the afternoon warmed, veterans from the American Legion arrived, men and women in navy caps edged with gold piping, shoulders straightened by muscle memory, saluting the metal and kneeling to rub Max's ears. One in particular stayed. Sergeant First Class Angela Price, early 40s, tall and rangy, with skin the smooth walnut of her Alabama upbringing, close-cropped black hair, a narrow scar that traced her cheek like an accent mark earned in Helmand, and posture so upright it seemed to hold up the sky. She wore jeans and a green field jacket, boots laced neat, and when she crouched and let Max sniff her hand, her voice softened into the cadence of someone who has steadied a lot of trembling. She had served with Daniel's unit for a brief rotation stateside, remembered a quiet kid with a surprising laugh who wrote long, careful letters home and ran his dog along the base fence at dusk. Looking now at the box and the dog's vigilant eyes, she said softly that metals meant different things to different people, but to the dead they meant memory, and to the living they meant duty. Right now, the dog was doing both. Dalton, hearing a voice the crowd respected, changed tactics. He praised the service of veterans, promised to fund a permanent display in the sanctuary with brass plaque and LED lighting, spoke of donors, visibility, preserving heritage, and just as his smile flickered toward the local news camera, a quiet elder stepped forward to address him. Mrs. Hattie Boone, 78, small and solid as a fence post, dark skin, the deep mahogany of her Carolina roots, gray hair wrapped in a paisley scarf, hands calloused from decades of tending roses. She, too, sat near the dog each day and said nothing, but now she eyed Dalton the way a gardener studies a fungus on a beloved leaf. In a voice soft enough to compel silence, she said that when a creature chooses a post, you honor the post and the creature, and that a thing cannot be made safe by locking it away, if the danger you're locking it from is the sort that wears a tie and shakes your hand. The lot breathed out a laugh that rustled like leaves, and Dalton's smile tightened at the edges. Through it all, Max barely shifted, but those who watched closely saw the way his eyes tracked two particular men who had begun to linger at the far curb. One tall and rope-thin, with a blonde beard braided into a mean little spear, denim jacket patched with motorcycle logos. The other, shorter with a boxy frame, cheeks smudged by a permanent 5 o'clock shadow. A Cubs cap dragged low, hands buried in his hoodie pocket. Their names, unknown to most in Millfield, were Caleb Pike and Joey Maris, and though they appeared merely curious, Maya's eye for trouble snagged on the way their gazes kept flicking from the dog to the church office door and back to each other, communicating in shrugs like men who were weighing risk against hunger. When she drifted casually in their direction to ask what brought them to such a tender spectacle, the bearded one smiled without his eyes and said he was there to pay respect to heroes, and the shorter one grunted something about dogs being smart, smarter than people sometimes. Maya said she agreed, then drifted away to jot the license plate of the scabbed-up pickup they climbed into when they finally left. As evening neared, Pastor James proposed a vigil, not a spectacle, just candles and a hymn, so the town could stand with the dog and the memory he guarded. He asked Angela to say a few words, Evelyn to lead a prayer, Sheriff Keene to keep watch, and while the sanctuary filled with a soft light that smelled faintly of wax and old wood, outside the air cooled and the maple leaves along the lot's edge clicked like coins in a gentle wind. Liam brought Max a bowl of fresh water and a slice of roast chicken saved from the church supper, which the shepherd accepted politely before laying his muzzle across the box again, as if to apologize for even the brief moment of inattention. It was then, just before the candles were lit, that a slight figure hurried up the walk, breathless, his sneakers squeaking over gravel, a boy of about 11 with a mop of dark curls and the fierce concentration of a falcon. This was Noah Bennett, altar server in training, small for his age, but quick with tasks, the kind of kid who knows where every candle stub and paperclip in the building lives. Cheeks flushed, he tugged on Liam's sleeve and whispered that he'd been putting hymnals away in the choir loft when he saw a man slip into the sacristy and out the back again with something bulky under his jacket. And when Noah had peeked out the upstairs window, he'd watched that same man, short, boxy, a baseball cap, hurry down the alley to the old feed store, disappear through a warped side door, and a moment later, Noah heard glass shatter and a dog bark. Not Max, a smaller dog maybe, or a man making a dog sound. Liam looked up, met Maya's eye, found Sheriff Keene at the edge of the crowd, and within minutes the quiet vigil transformed into a purposeful movement. Carla and Thomas took statements, Angela moved to stand beside Evelyn. Pastor James spoke calmly into the mic about community and courage, while giving a quick nod to Maya, as if blessing her to follow a different liturgy. Pursuit of truth. In that hum of attention, Max rose at last, slow and solemn, every vertebra working like a string of beads, and turned his head toward the alley behind the church, where shadows had begun to thicken, his ears spearing the dusk, a low sound building in his chest, like a distant storm. Approaching, and for the first time since he'd lain in the parking lot, he took a step, not away from the metal, but toward danger, and then, carefully, he repositioned his body so that the box was bracketed between his forelegs and the brick stair, guarded by weight and wall both, and he looked up at Evelyn as if to say, "Stay, guard this. I will be back," before fixing his stare on the alley again, waiting not for permission, but for the moment when duty and instinct would align into motion. The night air around Millfield thickened with a tension that felt almost visible, like mist rising from the cracked asphalt of the church parking lot, where candles flickered in trembling halos, and though the hymns sung by the congregation flowed out in gentle waves through the open doors, it could not fully drown out the rumble of unease that stirred when Max's low growl rolled across the crowd. Evelyn Whitaker froze, with her hand resting on the dog's ruff, feeling the vibration of muscle and bone beneath her palm, and her heart seized because she knew animals sensed things humans often ignored, and if Max was restless now, it was because something unseen prowled close. Sheriff Thomas Keene stepped forward, his boots crunching against gravel, and in the pale wash of street lamps, his square shoulders looked like pillars of authority, his clean-shaven face drawn into a scowl of focus as his instincts, which had been sharpened long ago by the night he lost his brother, told him this was no longer about curiosity seekers or grieving rituals, but about men who operated in shadows, and the memory of the two strangers with hard eyes and easy shrugs earlier gnawed at him like a splinter beneath the skin. Beside him, Deputy Carla Ruiz adjusted the strap of her duty belt and scanned the tree line, her sharp gaze darting like a hawk's, while Sergeant Angela Price crossed her arms over her field jacket, boots planted with the unshakable readiness of a soldier who had walked into ambushes before, and the three of them formed a silent cordon around Evelyn and the box, as if by instinct, because when danger grows near, the lines of defense close around what matters most. Maya Delgado, notebook clutched in one hand and her phone recorder in the other, edged closer to Liam and Noah, her copper hair catching the candlelight, and though she had come as a reporter, she now felt the thin line blur between observer and participant. For the story unfolding here was not a headline to chase, but a pulse to guard, and when Noah whispered again about the man slipping into the feed store, she made a decision born not of ambition, but of duty, the same kind that fueled Max's every movement. She would follow the thread, even if it pulled her into places darker than she had ever dared. At that very moment, Max lifted his head high, ears locked forward, amber eyes glowing in the dim, and his body shifted low like a coiled spring, ready to launch, his thick coat bristling along the spine. And without waiting for command, he gave one sharp bark that sliced the hymn in two, before lunging toward the alley. Gasps erupted, children cried out, and Evelyn half rose in panic, but Sheriff Keene lifted a hand to hold her back, barking an order to Carla to follow the dog, while he moved to circle the block, Angela shadowing him like a second heartbeat, and Maya, ignoring Dalton's protests that this was no business for civilians, sprinted after them, her boots slapping the pavement. Liam, dragging Noah by the arm close behind, because boys who stumble upon stories sometimes carry courage they don't yet understand. The alley was narrow, lined with dumpsters that smelled of yeast and flour from the bakery and old grease from the diner, shadows pooling where lamplight failed, and down its length Max streaked like a missile, his paws slapping in rhythm, the heavy sound echoing off brick, until he stopped abruptly before the warped door of the abandoned feed store. Muscles taut, teeth bared in a snarl, aimed at the darkness beyond the crack in the frame. Carla raised her flashlight and drew her sidearm in one motion, her voice steady as she called for anyone inside to come out. But the only reply was the shattering of glass deeper within and the scuffle of hurried boots across wooden floors. Sheriff Keene rounded the corner just in time to see Max shoulder the door open, the German shepherd forcing his way into gloom thick with dust and mold, and Angela swept in behind him, her scarred cheek catching the glow of the flashlight, while Maya, heart pounding but pen still clutched like a sword, slipped in last, determined to bear witness. The feed store was cavernous, its shelves long empty, except for scattered sacks, torn open to reveal mouse-chewed grain, the ceiling sagging with the weight of years, and in the center of the floor, surrounded by shards of broken display glass, stood the two men from earlier. Caleb Pike, with his braided beard and leather jacket, Joey Maris with his cap low and fists clenched, both caught mid-motion, as if guilt itself had frozen them. Pike sneered, his pale eyes glinting under fluorescent light that flickered erratically, and he growled that the metal belonged to no one here, that men like them had fought too and been forgotten, that if a dog wanted to play hero, it could guard them while they sold the relic for what it was worth. His words dripped with bitterness carved by years of being on the margins. Dishonor hardened into greed, and though Maya's stomach twisted, she felt her pen scratch across paper, because even poison deserved recording. Sheriff Keene leveled his voice like a steel beam, warning them that desecrating a fallen soldier's honor was theft not only of property, but of legacy. While Angela stepped forward, her boots echoing with a weight that spoke of deserts and firefights, her presence a reminder that sacrifice wore many faces. But before either law or memory could halt them, Joey lunged for the box they had hidden behind an overturned crate, and Max exploded forward, a growl ripping the silence as his body slammed against the man's legs, sending him sprawling, the metal box skittering across the floor with a metallic scrape until it slid to a stop against Maya's boot. For a heartbeat, the world froze. Joey writhing under the shepherd's weight, Pike reaching for a crowbar that glinted like a serpent in his fist, Angela bracing to intercept, Carla's gun trained steady. Thomason barking commands, Maya's heart hammering as she bent to scoop up the box, the bronze star within, catching the flicker of light like a heartbeat of Daniel Whitaker himself. Then chaos unfurled. Pike swung the crowbar. Angela ducked and drove her shoulder into his gut with soldier's precision. Carla stepped in to cuff Joey once Max released on command, and Sheriff Keene's voice thundered through the hollow store like judgment, declaring that this ground was no longer theirs to sully. Outside, townsfolk drawn by the noise gathered at the alley's mouth, whispers rippling like wind through wheat, and when Evelyn arrived, she clutched her chest at the sight of Max, standing tall beside Maya, the metal safe once more, and tears blurred her vision as she whispered her son's name into the night. Pike and Joey were dragged out in cuffs, spitting curses that rang hollow in the candlelit air, and as the crowd parted, Max trotted calmly back to his place at the church lot, laying down once again over the metal as if nothing had happened, as if duty was endless and danger merely a passing shadow. And the people of Millfield stood stunned, understanding now that this was no ordinary animal, but a sentinel shaped by love and loss, guarding not just metal in a box, but the living memory of a boy who had given everything. And thus the third chapter of the tale deepened into legend, each detail etched in the minds of those who witnessed it. And Maya knew in her bones that the story she was chasing was no longer for her paper alone. but for every soul hungry to believe that loyalty, stronger than death, still roamed the earth on four faithful legs. Morning broke with a soft haze over Millfield, the sunlight filtering through the thin veil of mist that clung to the church grounds as if reluctant to release the solemn air of the night before. And though the small town had grown used to the quiet rhythm of weekdays, the murmur of children waiting for the school bus, the sputter of old trucks warming up along gravel driveways, the smell of bread wafting from the bakery, the church parking lot had become the beating heart of something larger than routine, for Max still lay there, broad body coiled protectively around the metal box, his eyes sharp and unyielding, yet softened whenever Evelyn approached to brush her fingers along his fur. And in that simple image, the town saw both grief and hope made flesh, an unspoken prayer that sacrifice would not be forgotten. News had spread quickly, carried not only by local reporters like Maya Delgado, but by television crews who arrived with satellite vans, tripods, and voices pitched with practiced sympathy, their cameras angling to catch the shimmer of candle stubs still guttering in the dawn breeze. And while many parishioners worried about spectacle and exploitation, Pastor James Holloway reminded them that stories sometimes needed to travel farther than the streets they were born on, that faith multiplied when carried. And so he greeted each journalist with a gentle firmness, insisting that if they told the story, they must tell it whole, not as a curiosity, but as a testament. Sheriff Thomas Keene had little time for such abstractions. His duty focused instead on the practical fallout of the arrests from the feed store. Caleb Pike and Joey Maris had been booked at the county jail overnight. Their records revealed histories of petty theft, drunken disorder, and a dishonorable discharge for Pike that explained the bitterness in his words. But what unsettled Thomas more was the thin envelope found in Pike's jacket pocket, containing a photocopy of the metal citation with Daniel Whitaker's name neatly underlined, suggesting that someone else had commissioned the theft, someone with a reason to target that specific relic. He shared this over black coffee with Deputy Carla Ruiz as dawn lit their office, and together they pieced that Pike and Joey were small tools in a larger hand, a realization that settled over Thomas like frost. Millfield's grief had drawn not only mourners, but predators. Meanwhile, Maya wrestled with the duality of her profession, sitting cross-legged on the floor of the small motel room she had rented, her copper hair mussed from a restless night, laptop open to a blank page that should have become a draft, but instead pulsed with the weight of choice. To write the story quickly meant attention, headlines, maybe even a national byline. But to wait and understand more deeply meant risking being scooped by others. And yet she could not shake the look in Evelyn's eyes when she stroked Max's fur, nor the sense that to commodify that loyalty would be a second theft. So she closed the laptop, tied her boots, and walked back to the church, telling herself that sometimes bearing witness meant staying rather than broadcasting. Evelyn herself had risen early, her weary body aching as she packed a small basket of food, boiled eggs, sliced apples, leftover chicken, to share with Max. And as she walked through the crisp air, she thought of Daniel as a boy running barefoot through wet grass, his laughter ringing, Max chasing close behind, and her throat tightened at the thought that even death could not break that bond. She wore a plain gray shawl over her faded dress, her silver hair pinned neatly, and though sorrow shadowed her pale skin, her back was straighter. Today, for grief tempered by love sometimes forges a quiet steel. When she reached the lot, she found not only Max and Maya, but also Angela Price, standing sentinel, her lean figure in her field jacket, a mirror to the dog's unyielding posture, and together the three women mother, soldier, and reporter formed an unlikely triangle around the medal, each bound by different strands of duty, but unified by reverence. Angela had agreed to stay a few days in town, explaining in her measured Alabama drawl that leaving felt like betrayal, that she had seen too many fallen comrades remembered only in dusty plaques, and she would not let Daniel's story slip so easily into the past. As morning ripened into day, townsfolk arrived to leave offerings, small bouquets tied with ribbon, folded notes of thanks, even a child's drawing of a soldier holding hands with a dog under a shining sun. Max accepted each with calm dignity, sniffing at the tokens before resettling his massive frame over the box, his ears swiveling at every sound, his eyes always vigilant, and though he rarely moved, the occasional wag of his tail felt like benediction. Yet not all visitors came with pure hearts. Rick Dalton arrived again, stepping from his sleek black SUV in another tailored suit, his clean-shaven face arranged in a mask of concern, though his eyes glittered with calculation, and he addressed the crowd with grand gestures, declaring that a permanent memorial would draw tourism, funding, prestige, that Millfield could become a place of pilgrimage if only they entrusted him with oversight. But when he knelt too close to the box, Max's lips peeled back to reveal white fangs, and the low snarl that followed cut through Dalton's rehearsed pitch like a blade, sending him stumbling back, cheeks flushed with embarrassment, as chuckles rippled through the watching crowd. Evelyn's voice, steady and low, carried then, "This is not for profit. This is for memory. And he," she stroked Max's head, "is the only trustee we need." Dalton swallowed his retort, retreating to his car with a smile that did not reach his eyes, and Maya, ever perceptive, scribbled in her notebook that ambition often wears benevolence like a mask. That afternoon, Sheriff Keene returned with news. Pike and Joey had confessed they were promised payment by a man whose name they refused to give, only describing him as the one with the signet ring, and though vague, it was enough to stir unease among the townsfolk, for secrecy always points to power. Keene promised vigilance, ordering increased patrols near the church, but he also looked to Angela and Maya with an unspoken understanding that truth sometimes leaks more easily to those outside the badge. As dusk fell, the vigil resumed, lanterns glowing softer this time, the hymn quieter, less spectacle and more prayer, and Max sat regal among them, his fur gleaming bronze in the firelight, his eyes reflecting the flames, as though holding Daniel's memory alive within. Children nestled close to their mothers, veterans saluted again, and Evelyn whispered into the night that she felt her son near, that perhaps the dog had become a bridge between heaven and earth. Yet in the shadows, at the far edge of the lot, unseen by most, two figures watched, one tall, one compact, their outlines blurred by distance but their stillness unmistakable. And when at last the crowd dispersed and Max lowered his head onto the box once more, those figures melted into the darkness, leaving behind only the echo of footsteps and the sense that the town's trial was far from over, that the medal was not yet safe, and that the coming days would test not only the loyalty of a dog, but the courage of every soul who believed in what he guarded. By Wednesday, the weight of the story had swelled beyond Millfield, the small town becoming a reluctant stage upon which grief, loyalty, and greed performed their overlapping dramas, and though the rhythm of ordinary life tried to press on, the bakery ovens belching fragrant steam, the schoolyard echoing with children's shouts, tractors humming along distant fields, everyone's eyes and ears inevitably turned back to the white church and the gravel lot where Max still stood guard over the medal, his sable and tan body a living statue of devotion, his amber eyes glowing with that uncanny intelligence that seemed to bridge the silence between the living and the dead. And it was on this day that the threads of suspicion began to tighten into something far darker than simple theft. For Sheriff Thomas Keene, shoulders heavy under his tan uniform, drove back from the county jail with news that chilled him. Pike and Joey, the petty criminals caught days earlier, had been released on bail, posted by an unnamed benefactor who arrived in a black sedan, a man with gloved hands and a signet ring flashing at his finger, and though no one could produce a name, Keene felt in his gut the stirrings of a larger hand at play, one that reached into Millfield not for curiosity, but for possession. He returned to find the parking lot swollen with more strangers, cameras clicking, and at the edge of the crowd again stood Rick Dalton, the ambitious real estate developer, his clean-shaven face gleaming in the morning light as he spoke to a cluster of townsfolk about development opportunities and honoring history with modern infrastructure. And though his tone dripped with benevolence, Keene noticed the gleam in his eyes sharpen each time they flicked toward the metal box under Max's chest, as though profit glimmered brighter than reverence. Evelyn Whitaker sat close to the shepherd, as always, her silver hair tucked under her shawl, her lined face softened by a maternal pride that no grief could erode, and she whispered to Max stories of Daniel's childhood, how he once built a fort out of old hay bales and pretended he was protecting a kingdom, how he'd carried Max as a pup across a flooded ditch, how even as a teenager he would kneel at the edge of his bed and say quiet prayers for his mother before sleep. And the dog, as though understanding, thumped his tail once against the gravel and rested his head more firmly against the box. Beside her, Maya Delgado recorded every detail in her notebook, her copper hair glinting beneath the sun, her hazel eyes sharp and intent, but she no longer thought of bylines or deadlines. She thought of how truth sometimes demanded patience, that to tell the story honestly meant waiting until its arc revealed the depth of what loyalty truly meant. And she was beginning to suspect that the true antagonist was not Pike or Joey, but something larger, hidden behind suits and handshakes. Angela Price agreed. The veteran's rangy figure loomed nearby, arms crossed over her field jacket, her scarred cheek catching the light as she murmured to Sheriff Keene that Dalton's eagerness smelled wrong, that in war, the loudest promises often covered the darkest betrayals, and Keene, though reluctant to accuse without proof, felt his jaw tighten because her instinct mirrored his own. That afternoon, Dalton attempted another maneuver, calling a community meeting in the fellowship hall, spreading pastries and coffee like bait, and speaking smoothly of how Millfield could honor Daniel Whitaker and all veterans by erecting a memorial garden funded by private donors he claimed to represent, donors who insisted that the metal be transferred into their care for safekeeping. He assured everyone that Max's devotion could be symbolized with a bronze statue, that the town deserved something more permanent than a dog lying in gravel, and though some nodded uncertainly, Evelyn rose to her feet, her pale hands trembling, but her voice steady, as she declared that her son's memory was not for sale, that no statue could replace the living loyalty before them, and the room fell into silence, broken only by Max's distant bark echoing from outside, a sound that landed like divine punctuation. Dalton masked his frustration with a smile, but Maya caught the twitch at the corner of his mouth, the way his hand fiddled unconsciously with a gold cufflink, and she scribbled in her notes that ambition often betrayed itself, not in words, but in gestures. Later that night, as the vigil continued beneath the stars, Liam and Noah crept close to Maya to whisper that they had seen Dalton, meeting in hushed tones with Pike and Joey near the diner's back lot, a meeting too brief for comfort, and though the boys' voices trembled with the thrill of danger, Maya's pulse quickened with fear because it confirmed what she had suspected. Dalton was not merely opportunistic, he was entangled. Sheriff Keene convened a quiet council in Pastor James's office. Evelyn, Angela, Maya, Carla Ruiz, and a few trusted townsfolk. And together they laid the pieces out like a puzzle. The signet ring, the sudden appearance of donors, Dalton's maneuvers, Pike and Joey's release, the theft attempt. Angela leaned forward, her scar catching candlelight, and said in her steady soldier's cadence that medals were not just metal, they were currency in the black market of collectors who fetishized war relics, men who would pay thousands for authenticity, and that Dalton's mysterious donors were likely connected. Evelyn's eyes flashed with grief turned fierce, insisting that they would not let Daniel's sacrifice be bartered, and Keene promised that law would stand with love, though inside he feared that law alone might not suffice. Outside in the lot, Max stirred restlessly, ears swiveling, and when the vigil ended and candles were snuffed, he did not curl down to sleep, but stood, muscles taut, eyes trained, on the tree line where shadows swayed too heavily for mere wind. A presence lingered there, unseen but felt, and when Angela stepped out to check, she saw nothing but the rustle of leaves. Yet her instincts bristled, and she returned to whisper to Evelyn that danger would soon arrive, not by daylight, but by night. And sure enough, near midnight, headlights sliced across the distant road, cutting out abruptly as though a vehicle had killed its engine, and moments later, dark figures slunk across the field toward the church, men in hooded jackets, moving with the awkward precision of those who believe stealth equals invisibility. Max's growl thundered into the night, low and primal, shaking Evelyn awake from her half-doze on the steps, and within seconds, Sheriff Keene and Carla were outside, weapons drawn, Angela striding like iron behind them, Maya clutching her camera though her heart pounded. The intruders froze under the beam of a flashlight. 3 men this time, not Pike and Joey, but others, rougher, older, their faces half hidden, one with the glint of a signet ring on his finger, and though they raised their hands in feigned surrender, the air reeked of intent. Words clashed, threats hissed, but the moment boiled over when one man lunged suddenly, reaching not for a weapon, but for the metal box beneath Max's chest, and the shepherd launched like lightning, his teeth clamping onto the man's arm with a ferocity born not of rage, but of unbreakable duty. Chaos erupted. Keene shouting commands, Angela tackling another intruder, Carla wrestling a third into cuffs, Evelyn clutching the steps and praying aloud, Maya snapping photos with trembling hands, as if to etch the truth permanently into memory. And when at last the struggle ended, the 3 men lay subdued, one groaning from Max's bite, another pinned by Angela's knee, the third cursing as Carla locked restraints around his wrists. The signet ring glittered under the flashlight, proof at last of the shadowy benefactor's reach. The townsfolk who rushed from their homes, drawn by the noise, arrived to see the medal still safe, Max standing proudly over it, muzzle flecked with dust, but eyes blazing with triumph. And a hush fell across the night as if the town itself recognized that this dog was not merely loyal, but sanctified, a guardian chosen by something higher. Evelyn wept openly, sinking to her knees beside Max and wrapping her arms around his thick neck, whispering gratitude to her son in heaven, while Maya wrote in her heart, if not yet on paper, that the story had transcended journalism. It had become parable, proof that loyalty could turn aside even greed sharpened by darkness. And so, though dawn was still hours away, Millfield felt the weight of a new truth. The fight for Daniel Whitaker's memory was not over, but they no longer stood alone, for they had a sentinel with fur and fangs, and his watch was unending. Dawn rose over Millfield with a brilliance that felt almost ceremonial. The first rays of sun spilling like liquid gold across the church steeple and washing the gravel parking lot in warmth. Yet even in that tranquil glow, the memory of the midnight clash lingered, whispers rippling through the town like the toll of a distant bell. For people spoke of the signet ring, of Dalton's shadowed ties, of Max leaping with a ferocity that could only have been forged by love. And though Sheriff Thomas Keene moved among his deputies with the steadiness of a man determined to see law triumph, inside his chest he felt the slow burn of responsibility, knowing that what they had defended was not only a medal in a box, but the honor of a fallen soldier whose story had become the town's heartbeat. Evelyn Whitaker, silver hair pinned neatly, walked the lot with her shawl wrapped tight, her lined face illuminated by pride that outshone her grief, for she now saw her son's spirit in the steadfast form of the shepherd pressed close to the metal. And as she laid a trembling hand upon Max's fur, she whispered that Daniel could rest easier now, for loyalty had kept his sacrifice untarnished. The arrested intruders sat in cells by sunrise, their signet-ringed leader silent under questioning, his gaze cold and unreadable, and though Sheriff Keene promised the town he would pursue every lead until the network behind the theft was exposed, he knew some battles were larger than his jurisdiction. Still, the town had its closure, not in court documents, but in the image of Max, the German shepherd whose devotion had faced down greed and darkness. And that image spread far beyond Millfield, as Maya Delgado's careful reporting finally appeared in print and online, her words precise and reverent, describing not merely the spectacle of a dog guarding a medal, but the soul of a community galvanized by loyalty, sacrifice, and faith, and her photographs. Max crouched over the bronze star, Evelyn's hand resting upon his back, candles flickering around them, circulated across the nation, drawing tears from strangers who whispered prayers for soldiers they had lost. Angela Price stayed in town through the week, tall and rangy in her field jacket, scar catching the sunlight like a badge of resilience. And on Sunday morning she stood at the pulpit beside Pastor James to speak of Daniel Whitaker, recalling his quiet humor, his steady leadership, his devotion to both his unit and his dog, her voice firm with the cadence of soldier's testimony. And when she concluded, she saluted the medal resting in its box, and then bowed her head before Max, declaring to all that some comrades continue the watch even beyond the grave. The congregation wept openly. Veterans embraced one another. Children clutched flags, and Evelyn whispered through tears that her boy was not forgotten. That same day, Rick Dalton, exposed by murmurs and suspicion, attempted to defend himself at the meeting of church trustees, his clean-shaven face slick with nervous sweat, his polished words stumbling as Maya read aloud her notes of his secret meetings with Pike and Joey, her voice steady as she described how ambition had warped remembrance into commodity. And when silence fell, it was Mrs. Hattie Boone, stooped yet unyielding, who rose from her pew and in her soft Carolina drawl said that a man who treats memory like merchandise has no place leading a community built on sacrifice. And with that simple sentence, the trustees voted Dalton out, his departure silent, save for the crunch of his polished shoes fading down the gravel, his empire of schemes collapsing beneath the weight of a dog's growl and a town's unity. In the days that followed, the church parking lot transformed not into a spectacle, but into a sanctuary. Townsfolk brought flowers, flags, and simple offerings. School children painted rocks with Daniel's name. Veterans placed their own medals beside the bronze star in gestures of shared remembrance, and Max remained unmoved, always curled around the box, lifting his head to acknowledge each visitor with eyes that seemed to speak the language of gratitude. He ate when Evelyn brought him food, drank from bowls set by Liam and Noah, but he never left his post except to stretch briefly before resettling, as if tethered by invisible orders to guard until his last breath. And then one golden afternoon, when the maples blazed with autumn fire and the air smelled of ripe apples, the town gathered for the unveiling of a new memorial. Not the gaudy garden Dalton had pitched, but a simple, polished stone, set at the lot's edge, engraved with Daniel Whitaker's name, his service, and the words, "Loyalty never dies," chosen by Evelyn after a dream in which she swore she heard her son's laugh carried on the wind. Pastor James blessed the stone. Angela placed her own unit patch upon it. Liam and Noah recited a poem they had written, and Maya captured every moment with her lens, not as a reporter chasing headlines, but as a witness consecrating truth. When the time came, Evelyn bent to Max and clipped around his thick neck a ribbon of blue, holding the bronze star itself, the medal Daniel had earned with his life, and though tears blurred her eyes, she smiled as Max sat tall, chest broad, muzzle lifted, the medal gleaming against his fur, like it had found its rightful home at last. Veterans saluted, children clapped, and the town's heart swelled with the certainty that they were watching history, written not in marble, but in loyalty. That night, as twilight deepened and candles flickered against the stone, Evelyn lingered beside Max, stroking his fur, whispering to him that he could rest when he was ready, that Daniel was safe now in memory, and though the shepherd's amber eyes remained vigilant, there was a softness in his posture, as if he understood that his duty had been fulfilled. He lowered his head against her lap, tail thumping once, and, for a moment, the world felt still, the boundaries between life and death blurred by the bond of love. In the weeks that followed, Max remained a fixture at the church, still guarding, though less tense now, more at peace, as if he knew the town had taken up the watch alongside him, and when winter's first snow dusted the lot white, the sight of him lying serenely before the polished stone with the metal gleaming at his chest became an icon of faith, a reminder carved into memory that loyalty does not fade, that love outlasts loss, and that sometimes heaven leaves guardians in fur and paw prints to remind the living of what is eternal. And thus the story closed, not with a final bark, but with a vigil unending, a community forever changed, and a dog whose devotion bridged earth and eternity.